Today's lecture is going to be on the 1982 Falklands or the Malvinas War. I should ask, how many of you speak Spanish in here? Should I give this lecture in English or Spanish? English. I pretty guessed that. Actually, a couple of years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, I got a contract to do this cruise, Chile to Buenos Aires, back to Chile on Norwegian Sun, and over half the people were Spanish speakers. So half of my lectures had to be in Spanish. So I actually have this one in Spanish ready to go. If you're not familiar with where the Falklands are, given that we won't even get there, they're about right there off the coast of Argentina, about a little over 500 miles from the nearest part of the Argentine coast. And I also want to point out where South Georgia is. That will be part of my talk a little bit later. South Georgia there on the lower right. Here's a map of the Falklands. There's actually two big islands, East Falkland and West Falkland. And the thing I want to point out is, first, there's Stanley, where we were going to go. And there are also a series of other towns and cities on the map. The white dots represent the bigger places, and the black dots represent the smaller villages or towns. I said that wrong. The white dots represent places with more than 35 people, and the black dots represent places with less than 35 people. Total population about 3,500, of which over half live in Stanley. Here's a view from one of the ships where we anchor out there. It's a tender port, so you always have to anchor out and take a tender in. And here's a little bit closer view. This is Stanley. It's a rocky island, or islands. No real high mountains or anything like that. Stanley is there in the distance. And I show you this picture. First, I'm going to now show you a little video from this same spot. I was doing the battlefields tour when I took this picture. And here's a little video from essentially the same spot. That's wind in the background. It can be pretty windy. And we're just panning around to get a sense of the countryside. So Stanley is right about over in there, off in the far distance. And we were here at this spot for about 10 minutes while the guide was telling us about battles that had taken place right in this area. So there's Stanley off in the distance. Notice it's a nice, bright, sunny day. Windy. And we were here for no more than 10 or 15 minutes, and this is a hailstorm. The weather can change very quickly in the Falklands. You can easily have 4 seasons in the same morning. There's a few of the other shots, just kind of looking around. This is Stanley. And if we had taken a tender in, we would have gotten off here by the tour headquarters, local visitor center. And there's the Anglican Cathedral. It's the southernmost Anglican cathedral in the world. And here's some houses in the town. In the summertime, it's a pretty nice place some days. And in the wintertime, it's a pretty bleak place all the time. The history here is interesting. Nobody knows who first found the Falkland Islands, who was the first Europeans to sail a ship to the Falklands. But here's an 1575 map. And on that map, can you see some islands? Those have to be the Falkland Islands. They're right where the Falklands are. There's no other islands in the whole area. So those have to be the Falkland Islands on a 1575 map. But in 1592, 17 years later, a guy by the name of John Davies wrote that he found some islands that nobody ever had seen before. So he's claiming that he discovered these islands, even though they show up on the earlier maps. The first reference we have of anybody landing on the islands is the men led by Captain John Strong, and he sent some men ashore to find water, which they didn't find very much. They killed some birds, very easy to do because the birds did not know people and weren't afraid or anything, but they could not find much else other than a little bit of water and some fresh kill birds. He was the one that named the islands the Falkland Islands. The sponsor of his particular voyage was Viscount Falkland. Right near the end of what we in the United States called the French and Indian War, the French in Canada started to leave. Some went down to Louisiana, some went to the French islands in the Caribbean, but there were some French from Canada that went all the way down to the Falkland Islands and set up a small village on East Falkland Island, on the north shore of East Falkland Island. They named their town St. Louis, and they named the islands Las Islas Malvinas for St. Malo, the town where they had come from back in France. Under the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, when the Portuguese and the Spanish split up the world, this should have been part of the Spanish territory, the Spanish half of the world. And so the French gave up their claims to this island, and Spanish had it. They kept the same little town and simply changed the name to Puerto Soledad. A couple of years later, a British expedition landed on West Falkland and set up a small settlement, but they also sent a ship that explored and ran into the French. So they found out the French were on East Falkland. They had their little settlement there. The Spanish, a couple of years later, sent a fleet out to the islands. They kind of knew about them, and they knew that the French and the British were there. They tried to kick them out. A couple of years later, there was an agreement, diplomatic negotiations between the three countries, and it was agreed that they just kind of let it go. We'd have a British settlement on West Falkland and a French-Spanish settlement on East Falkland. And that's the way it stayed, although those settlements were very, very small and did not do very much. The British ultimately abandoned their settlement, and ultimately the French and Spanish abandoned their settlement. So there's a period of time in the 1700s, 1800s, where everything is pretty much confused. And then the revolutions on the mainland start to take place, and Argentina ultimately comes free from Spain, and people were stopping there. Whalers that were going down to the South Atlantic to down near the Antarctic would stop and get fresh water and kill some seals and birds for food and stuff. But nobody was living there to any great extent. The Argentines in 1832, after Argentina was independent, decided that they were going to set up a colony there. They sent out a group of people with a governor. The colonists rebelled against the governor, killed him, and many of them left, but a small number of Argentines were left on East Falkland. Just about the same time, the British arrived and set up a settlement. They claimed the whole place and set up a settlement near Stanley. The Argentines continued to claim it. British continued to claim it. The Spanish, pissed off at the Argentines for breaking away, recognized the British claims. Ultimately, over a period of time, the Americans recognized. There was one moment, I think I've got a slide that says that here. Some American whalers were captured near the island by the British. To get them released, the U.S. recognized British claims to the island. And the British had set up a company to administer the islands. That company still exists today as the Falkland Island Company, and what they found was that the best use of the islands is to raise sheep. And although the population is just a couple of thousand people, there are a couple of million sheep on the island. So sheep raising is the main occupation there. It became an important place for ships going around the Horn prior to the construction of the Panama Canal, ships taking people, for example, to the California Gold Rush. It was a stop for water and food again. And then by the late 1800s, it became a coaling port. Coal was shipped in, and then ships could stop there and refuel with with coal. Britain, by this time, claimed a number of different territories, including land on the Antarctic Peninsula, South Georgia Island, and so forth, all being administered from Stanley. It was the headquarters capital for all of British territories in the South Atlantic. You're here mainly to hear about the 1982 war, but you may be unfamiliar with the fact that there was a major battle here at the beginning of the First World War. A German fleet had sailed across the Indian Ocean, across the Pacific, had attacked Allied shipping, particularly British shipping in the South Pacific, and off the coast of Chile had a big battle, had sunk a couple of British warships, and then had escaped. And nobody knew where they went, but the British guessed that they might head around the Horn and go to the Falkland Islands. So Britain sent a fleet down there and got there first. They had 4 warships in Stanley Harbor, and when the German ships appeared on the horizon, almost out of food, almost out of water, and almost out of coal, so they could not steam very well, whereas the British were freshly supplied. Big battle took place, the first battle of the Falklands, and the British sank all of the German cruisers. Germans lost almost everybody, and only a couple of British men were killed. But major victories, first major victory for the British in the First World War at sea. During the 1930s and from then on, whenever there was an election or problems in Argentina, the Argentine government would come up with the slogan that they still have today. Basically, in Spanish, it said the Falklands, or the Malvinas, their name for it, were, are, and will be Argentine. And they still say that today. I bought a map in Buenos Aires of Patagonia, and it has the Malvinas on it. And clearly, they cannot produce a map in Argentina that does not show the Malvinas as Argentine. But things really got kind of going in the Second World War. Argentina was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to declare war on Germany. They had much sympathy for the Germans, and even after the war, lots of escaped Germans ended up in southern South America. Continuing in the 60s and the 70s, whenever there were problems in Argentina, they came up with this idea that they would repossess someday the Falkland Islands. In '76, a military government took over in Argentina, and it was a terrible military government. This was the period that they literally were rounding up people and they disappeared. Thousands, tens of thousands of people were simply disappeared in Argentina. And that military government continued with this idea of retaking the Falkland Islands. In Great Britain, Margaret Thatcher had become prime minister, and she had a conservative government that, among other things, was talking about reducing the national budget by reducing military expenditures. They were going to get rid of various special military groups like the Special Forces and Marines. They were going to sell off many of their warships. But she became the head of the British government. In early '82, the general who was the head of the Argentine junta decided that they would invade the Falkland Islands in the spring. Now remember, we're in South America here. Spring means somewhere September, October. So he's thinking 6 months ahead, give his military plenty of time to plan to invade the Falkland Islands. Now, I'm going to jump away from the Falklands, and we're going to go to the South Georgia Islands, which are a little bit farther into the South Atlantic, a little bit farther away from the mainland. But we'll start with this guy, a man by the name of Constantino Davidoff. He was a scrap merchant in Argentina, and he got a contract to go to the South Georgia Islands and to dismantle and take the scrap metal from the old whaling station that was on the South Georgia Islands. I've never been there, but here's a few pictures from the web. It's a very isolated area, very rocky, very cold, windy area. And again, these are pictures just off the web. That's what Davidoff had gotten the contract to kind of dismantle and take the metal back to Argentina. So on March 19th of 1982, a group of about 40 Argentine metal dismantlers arrived on the island, and they raised the Argentine flag. There were only a few British scientists there, most of them at the spot where the Argentines had landed. There were a couple of wildlife people camped in the interior of the island, but most of them were right there where the Argentines had come in. And the British demanded that the Argentines at least take down the flag while they did their work, and the Argentines refused. So the Argentine ship that was taking them there left. The metal workers were there, and this dispute went on. But the British, who had a single ship for the government, the local administration, sent a group of about 22 soldiers to the island to kick out the Argentine workers. So 22 Royal Marines arrived, and a couple days later, the Argentines arrived in force with about 40 men, helicopters, warships. One of the helicopters was actually shot down by the 22 British Marines, but within a day, the Marines surrendered because they realized that they were totally outnumbered, and they and the scientists could, in fact, get killed. There's the helicopter that got shot down, and there's the Marines just before the Argentines arrived. The Marines were rounded up, put on an Argentine ship, and taken to Montevideo to be released. They got back to England at the end of April. A group of Argentine Marines remained on the island, but shortly thereafter, the Royal Marines landed in force, and a short battle began to take place. The Argentines had a couple of warships not too far away, including one submarine. The submarine got shot up, and if you're on a submarine, you don't want to submerge with holes in your hull. So the only thing the Argentines could do was run it aground. There were some Argentines killed, and ultimately the South Georgia was retaken. But the fact that this beginning of the battles there in South Georgia had started caused the Argentines to accelerate their plans for the Falklands. So instead of thinking the spring, that is to say September, October, they now had to start thinking in terms of fall, which is not necessarily the time you want to invade the Falkland Islands. So the Argentine government accelerates their plans. And on April 2nd, the Argentines invaded. Most of them entered into Stanley, took over Stanley within the first day, but literally thousands of Argentine special forces, Marines and their special forces, were involved in the initial invasion. At the time, it happened to be there was a unit of about 32 British soldiers stationed in the Falklands, but right then was when they were doing their annual changeover. So there were, in fact, two groups of soldiers. So something over 50 British soldiers were on the island, but they, compared to several thousand Argentines, the Brits had to surrender. So the British surrendered. They, in fact, were rounded up and sent off to Montevideo like the ones from South Georgia. And Argentine troops poured into the islands. But the special forces and Marines left, and the occupying group were basically conscripts. On here, there's where Stanley is located. It's on this inner harbor. There's where Marina usually, and I modified this morning and added the quote marks around usually. We're not going to be there, but we're out in that outer bay, which can be fairly rough. But the Argentines came in from a couple different directions and quickly overran Stanley and the other parts of the islands. So this is an English paper, Argentina invades. Notice there with the arrow, the little one headline, oil. There is oil in the general area of the Falkland Islands, mainly to the north, and people always say, well, why do you do all this stuff for some sheep and a couple thousand people? Well, there's oil, and that's enough said.
It would appear the sun has set on yet another corner of the British Empire, this one far down in the South Atlantic. Argentina today invaded and seized the Falkland Islands, which have been under British rule for nearly 150 years. Britain promptly broke diplomatic relations with Argentina, sent several of Her Majesty's warships steaming south, and appealed to the United Nations. It all seems like something out of the 18th century, but the British, and for that matter the Americans, are not amused. We have two reports. First, here is Bob Dyke in London.
Argentina claimed recovery of the Falklands hours before the British government admitted the invasion had taken place.
I have to confirm that an Argentine military attack on Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands has taken place, and that Port Stanley is now occupied by Argentine military forces.
The military odds were against the British from the outset today. Only a handful of 60 to 70 Royal Marines and an additional civilian defense force to protect the island's 1,800 residents and more than 600,000 sheep. The Argentinians sent a fleet of warships loaded with an estimated 4,000 troops. A Falkland Island amateur radio operator monitored here in Britain described what he saw.
About 500 personnel in Stanley, about 500 personnel in Stanley, and the aircraft carrier was believed to be carrying 1,500, 1,500.
Argentina says one of its officers was killed during the invasion. Apparently none of the islanders was hurt. Most of Falkland's inhabitants are descendants of the British, who expelled Argentina from the islands 150 years ago. Argentina says the Falklanders surrendered today as meekly as the sheep they've been raising there for generations.
You may have noticed it said that there were 60 or 70 British soldiers there. They didn't really remember that the 22 had been sent off to the South Georgia Islands, so there were only about 50 actually on the island. But here's some of the British soldiers surrendering to the Argentines. And that's a Argentine news magazine headlining. These are some of the conscripts. I need to mention something about the conscripts. In Argentina, young men on their 18th birthday have to go into the military for 1 year. And it's during the year that you turn 18, you serve that year. So if you turn 18 on December 28th, you still would go in when you were 17 early in the year and serve that year. January and February in Argentina are summer vacation months. So nobody wants to go in then. So at the earliest, they go in about when school starts. In Argentina, school started this past Monday. So end of February, 1st of March, you start as a conscript. You go to a military base in your home province, the equivalent of a state. And you go in, you have to be there by noon on Monday, and you can go home by noon on Friday. So you only have essentially 4 days. And of course, you're not going to spend Christmas time there. So really, the training is about 8 months, of which you're doing basically 4 days a week. And these guys are here in the early 1982, have just become soldiers. Many of them have never had a gun in their hand, but they are now the occupiers of the Falkland Islands. There's the store of the Falkland Islands Company. If we had made it into Stanley, you would have walked down the street past that store. Here's one of the large Argentine amphibious tractors that they used as the invading force. And in the background there, you see the Anglican Cathedral. Argentines forgot about one thing. And Margaret Thatcher said, "We're going to war." Immediately. She was not prepared to go to war, but that didn't matter too much. They got people together as quickly as possible, called troops back. They had some warships in the Mediterranean near Gibraltar that were able to sail first, but as quickly as they could, they got equipment onto ships and sent it down. Some stuff was actually flown down to Ascension Island in the South Atlantic and then put aboard ships. There's where Ascension Island is, roughly 4,000 miles from the Falkland Islands. That's the closest British base, whereas the Falkland Islands are about 500 miles from the Argentine mainland. But they had to, British had to go down to Ascension Island and use that as their jumping off place to head south. On May 1st, a British Vulcan bomber, one big bomber, bombed the airport at Stanley. To do that, this plane only had range to go about 1/3 of the way. So what they did was send this plane with several tankers to go south. The tankers refueled the Vulcan and one of the tankers, and then the one tanker and the Vulcan went further, and then that tanker refueled the Vulcan and continued on, whereas that tanker returned back, had to be refueled in the air to get back to Ascension. Same thing on the return. There had to be tankers waiting for it 1/3 of the way back and 2/3 of the way back. It didn't do much damage. The Vulcans actually attacked 2 or 3, 4 times, I think. But psychologically, it meant that the Argentines all of a sudden knew that the British could bomb the Falklands. They also could bomb any of the bases on the mainland. And it meant that the Argentines had to keep forces back, fighters, for example, on the mainland, just in case the British attacked with this bomber. The next day, this warship, the ex-USS Phoenix cruiser, now the Belgrano, was sailing near the Falklands. It wasn't in the zone that the British said that they were going to defend, a 200-mile radius, but it was very, very close. There's the radius, and the Belgrano was just outside that on the bottom there of the screen. But 200 miles on a cruiser is like 9 hours, 10 hours of sailing. And by this time, there were British ships in the area, and this cruiser could have gone in. So a British submarine, atomic submarine, that had been trailing the Belgrano, asked for permission, and it was given permission to open fire, and the result was that the Belgrano was sunk. About 1/3 of the Argentine losses killed were on the sinking of the Belgrano. Wasn't over 1,000, it was actually about 600 killed. The British had sent naval forces, including 2 aircraft carriers. Incidentally, the Argentines had one former U.S. aircraft carrier in their fleet. It never left port. As soon as that Vulcan bomber had attacked, the Argentines were afraid of what would happen. They also were now afraid that the British had some submarines. They actually had 3 submarines in the area, and that they would lose their aircraft carrier. So the Argentine aircraft carrier did not take part. The British aircraft carriers were fairly small. They're not like the big U.S. carriers, but they could carry a few jets, particularly what are called Harrier jets. These are vertical takeoff jets, so they did have some air support, but not very much. Within that 200-mile range, the British lost a number of ships. And again, there's that circle for the 200-mile range around the Falklands. The British ultimately lost 4 warships, 1 troop carrier ship, Sir Galahad, and 1 large cargo ship, along of which lots of smaller ships. There's one of the frigates, Sheffield. Here's the Argent. And the last of them is the Coventry. And ultimately the Atlantic Conveyor, which was one of the big cargo ships. This is an interesting story on the Atlantic Conveyor. It was right by the carriers, and it was sunk by a French missile that the Argentines had, an Exocet missile, and the missile was programmed to go for the biggest thing it could find. And it found the Atlantic Conveyor. It could have hit one of the carriers. If the British had lost one of the carriers, they probably would have lost the war. But instead, the missile was programmed for the biggest ship, and it went for this one. It was a terrible loss. This ship, among other things, was carrying a lot of helicopters, 5 smaller ones and 8 big double-rotor helicopters. And only one of the big helicopters had taken off, had been put back into operation, had gotten off. And so 7 out of the 8 big British helicopters were sunk when this one went down. And that was a big loss because the British were figuring to use the big troop-carrying helicopters to move men around, and instead they had to walk. And this is the Sir Galahad. It was a troop-carrying ship, and a large number of Welsh guards were on this when it was hit, and that was the biggest loss the British had, was in the sinking of the Sir Galahad. British lost 6 big ships, including some smaller ones. The British lost 10 planes. About half of the Harriers that they lost were actually accidental or pilot error, so only about 5 were shot down by the Argentines. The Argentines lost the submarine Santa Fe and the Belgrano and lots of smaller ships, and almost half of their good airplanes. Some shot down at sea, some shot down from land. There was an attack by British Special Forces on an Argentine air base before the British invasion, and they wiped out a lot of the ground attack planes in that incident. Here's some of the air action. That's one of the Argentine Mirages. This is actually a painting done by an Argentine pilot describing when he was attacking the ships. Most of the time, the Argentines went for the warships, not the cargo ships. They were trained to go for the warships, and I'll mention that again later. The Argentines were using bombs, regular bombs, and the bombs had fuses, and they had to set for a period of time before they would go off. They bombed very, very low. They came in as low as they could, and the fuses didn't have time to set. So in several cases, Argentine bombs hit British ships but did not explode. There's 2 Argentine Skyhawks there coming in on an attack. These are former U.S. fighters or fighter bombers. There's our Harriers again. And here's a little video on Harriers.
HMS Hermes, 10 weeks into the war. Morgan and his wingman take off and head for the islands. Morgan and his wingman arrive to find a horrifying scene. 2 British ships have been attacked by Argentine Skyhawks. Morgan's first thought, that the Argentines will be back to finish the job. The Harriers keep watch for 40 long minutes. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Morgan spots trouble.
To my absolute horror, saw about half a mile to the east a line of 4 aircraft, obviously running into attack. The only imperative now was to try and shoot down those aircraft.
Morgan has just seconds to react. Years of training allow muscle memory to kick in fast.
Locked the missile onto him. The missile locked straight away. Fired it immediately, and it came off my port wing and went straight up the guy's jet pipe and just vaporized the aircraft.
That's 1 Skyhawk down, but there's 3 more to go.
As I rolled the aircraft back upright again after the first missile shot, I was pointing directly at him. Locked my second missile. The missile followed him and took him out at 90 degrees.
There's 2 aircraft left, but Morgan is out of missiles. He turns to climb and hopes that his wingman has his back.
I looked back over my shoulder in the climb and saw my wingman fire a missile. A few seconds later, there was a massive explosion as it hit the Skyhawk.
The last Skyhawk sees the writing on the wall. When the Harriers look around, he's nowhere to be found.
On the night of the 21st, 22nd, 1982, the British invaded. They invaded around San Carlos Bay, which is up there in the north part of East Falkland, which is a long way from Stanley, and there are no roads, and they no longer have the big helicopters. They did have a few very, very light tracked vehicles, but not very much. So the British go in. Over the next couple of weeks, they march inland, and it's basically what the British refer to as gomping across the countryside, and it's very rough countryside. They only had one of the big Chinook helicopters, and they were using it mainly to bring up ammunition and take out wounded. Ultimately, the last battles were right around Stanley, in the hills right around Stanley, and very rough terrain. But these are British special forces. They did basically fight at night, and they're fighting Argentine recruits, the conscripts, who in some cases had not even fired a gun. The British officers led from the front. In fact, in percentage terms, more British officers were killed than enlisted men. Argentine officers led from Stanley, and very few of them were killed. This is one of the Argentine helicopters that was shot down. There's another one. And I put this one in just to show. I've done the battlefields tour a couple of times. That's the Argentine helicopter. And there is equipment scattered around the countryside. By June 11th, 12th, they were fighting in these hills, and by the 14th, they were in Stanley, and the Argentines surrendered. There was very little fighting in Stanley itself. These are some of the Argentine conscripts that have been rounded up and ultimately sent back to Argentina. There is a set of monuments down the street from the Falkland Island Company and the church. It's easy to walk down there, and this is that monument. Around the edges of the monument, there are plaques where all the British soldiers that were killed are identified by unit. And ultimately, there's also a statue there for Margaret Thatcher. She did actually go down to the Falklands, and there she is with some of the troops. Quickly to finish, a couple points to ponder. If the invasion had been put off to the spring, that is to say 6 months later, the two British landing ships that were used were already sold and would have been turned over to the new countries that were going to take over them. One of the aircraft carriers was supposed to be scrapped. It was scrapped afterwards, but it was supposed to be scrapped, would not have been available. And the British Marines, according to Thatcher, were going to be disbanded and blended into the rest of the Argentine army. Results might have been different. On the Argentine side, if they had kept their well-trained special forces and Marines on the island instead of sending in conscripts as the occupiers, if they had used their officer corps in the way in which most other armies would, that is to put them near the front, if they had set their bomb fuses correctly, the results might have been different. If the Argentine air attacks had been different, if they had aimed at the troop ships, not the warships, the British would not have been able to invade, would certainly not have been able to supply their troops. If they had had the Exocet hit one of the carriers instead of the Atlantic conveyor, things would have been different. If they had had a few more Exocet missiles, they only had about 6. If they had a few more, things might have been different. With regard to the point of the fuses on the bombs, actually, the Argentines heard a BBC broadcast that said, oh, the Argentines aren't very successful in bombing because they're not setting their fuses right. And the Argentines heard it late in the battle. They were setting their fuses better. But this is the media. One last thing, this is where they came from. Up in San Carlos is there on the upper left of East Falkland Island. Near there is Goose Green and Darwin, and there was some big fighting near Goose Green and Darwin. In fact, one of the British commanders that won the Victoria Cross died in the fighting. He was leading his men from the front at Goose Green, Darwin. And this is windy. And there's Darwin and Goose Green off to the left. There's Darwin. That's one of the smaller settlements. And Goose Green is one of the really big ones. I think it's second biggest to Stanley. So there's Goose Green. Goose Green is significant not just because of the battle that was fought here. The Argentines rounded up everybody from Darwin and Goose Green and held them in the church. And there were some reports during the fighting that the people in the church were being tortured and stuff. It turned out not to be the case. There's the church at Goose Green. Normally, tours do not go out to Goose Green, and I was lucky enough about 4 or 5 years ago to go out there. I was on a ship that had a lot of Argentines, and we went out to Goose Green. Because Goose Green is where the Argentine cemetery is. And there were people on the tour, that were especially on that particular tour, to go out to visit the cemetery where their loved ones were buried. Like the memorial in Stanley for the British soldiers, there are plaques here for naming all the Argentine soldiers that were killed. And there are some that are simply identified as unknown soldiers. If you paid attention when you were going to the cruise terminal in Buenos Aires, just before you got to the cruise terminal in your taxi or your Uber, you probably went past the Argentine Naval Headquarters, and there is one of the amphibious tractors that was used in evasion there, as well as one of the Skyhawk planes that was there. The question always is, can the Argentines do it again? Well, there used to be a small airport by Stanley. There is now a big international airport in the middle of East Falkland Island, and there is a big British forces there. They always say there's about 3,500 people on the Falklands. That is not true. There's 3,500 civilians and who knows how many soldiers, but it is a big base. And to finish here, that's what you'll see if you had gone ashore in Stanley. And many of the shops will have a sign that says something like that. My next talk is going to be probably tomorrow, surprise, and it's going to be on Patagonian wildlife, and also I'll talk about the Beagle Channel glaciers that we will see when we leave Ushuaia a couple days from now. Hope to see you then.